Well, I hope you enjoyed Bob Anderson's presentation as much as I did, and thank God he didn't leave us on a totally negative note. I was going to go back and make arrangements with the kitchen if they could maybe make the oven available to us, and we could.
Probably electric.
Well, yeah, right. With our luck, it'd be electric, right? And we could one by one put our heads in it. But what Bob concluded with is absolutely right. There are lots of people like us out there. We just haven't found each other yet. That's not my idea. Ron Paul made that comment to us when he came to Atlanta for a seminar on money in May of '83. He said as he speaks around the country, he sees a scattered fellowship of like-minded free market, free money, honest money people. We're coming together. It'll just take a little more time. Fee, as you probably have now perceived, has a rather large constellation of stars and intellectual luminaries. This next gentleman is, I guess, one of my favorites, at the risk of embarrassing Ed Opitz. Perhaps it's his very distinguished countenance, but Ed kind of scintillates, at least that's my term for what he does. He sparkles with wit and intelligence, and I think you'll very much enjoy Ed as he speaks to us on his reflections on the market economy. So if you please welcome with me Reverend Edmund Opitz.
Dick, you introduced me in a way that's pretty hard to live up to. I'm always pleased to come down to Atlanta, not just because of the attractions of this area, but we raised two daughters, both of whom have enough sense to have moved to Atlanta where they live and work. So I'll come down here, a chance to visit them. And then I grew up with the Boston Braves, and the Atlanta Boston Braves are a good baseball team, and I come down for that reason. And brag a bit about my daughter. She's with WETV, and she won an Emmy last June for set design. She's in the art department. Now, you've heard Bob Anderson. Bob is sort of an evangelist for our cause. You'll be hearing Howard Bacher, another member of our staff, and also Clarence Carson, who's written a great deal for the Freeman and who's been on a number of programs that the Foundation puts on. And you'll perceive, I think, that Bob and Howard and Clarence and myself are quite different personalities. A different temperament, different background, different professional training, different approach to the subject, slightly different ideas. But as I say, we're all of us, Bob and Howard and Clarence and myself, we're all doing the Lord's work, they in their way, and I in his. They know I'm only kidding, and I'm kidding for sure. Good to come down here for another reason, too, because we see some old friends who've been up at the Foundation. From Demarest, Georgia over here, and from Dublin, Georgia over here. John Taylor has been up there. So, anyway, it's good to be here. It comes as no surprise, and I'm going to be talking about economics, free market economics, not so much the exposition of the economy itself or economic theory as some of the things that are implied with reference to a free market economy. We've been treated to a large dose from the people on the other side of the fence, the liberals, the left-wingers, as to how moral they are. They have produced a government with compassion. They are concerned about the poor. Our concern is only for the rich, and so on. This, I think, is nonsense. Any person of goodwill, all of us here, people of goodwill, want to see other people better off. No person of goodwill wants other people worse off. We all want to see other people better off, better housed, better clothed, better fed, better educated, healthier, with better medical care, and so on. There's no monopoly of virtue on the left, but quite the contrary, it seems to me. The question is, the debate between the left and the right is not who has the interests of other people mostly at heart. The question is, how do you go about achieving these admittedly desirable goals of people being better housed, better fed, and so on? They say, get the government to do these things, and we say nonsense. The government is not an economic institution. If you want to get people better housed, what you have to do is build more housing units, and the free market does that better than the government does it, far better. There were some dramatic figures some years ago. A fellow named Martin Anderson, whose name you've seen in connection with the White House. He's now at the Hoover Institution. Martin was lectured for us in Irvington years ago, wrote a book published by MIT Press, a genuine study of housing during the period 1960-1970, 10-year period. He found that urban renewal had destroyed roughly 125,000 housing units. Now, the ones they destroyed were in the slums, and admittedly there are places in New York and in most other major cities where none of us would want to live or want other people to live. Bad housing conditions, crowded, and so on. But they destroyed 125,000 of these and built roughly 27,000 with a net deficit of close to 100,000. 96, 97,000 housing units on balance were destroyed. People were moved out of the slums where the housing was bad and crowded into situations even worse and more crowded, and the housing units that were built were priced at a level far above what the so-called poor could afford. So on net balance, the government program of housing did not build more housing units for the people who needed them, and likewise the production of food, clothing, or whatever. When people are free to expend their energies and their talents as they themselves direct, they produce more things than if the government or some other agency tells them what to do and what not to do. So if your concern is to have better conditions for more people, turn the market loose. So it is not a case that the left has a monopoly of virtue and compassion and we of the right do not. In practical terms, the situation is quite the reverse. I'm going to be talking about what this market economy implies as to several other important values of life. There is in the private sector at the present time a gigantic industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's called the press. I'm using the term the press very broadly to include not only newspapers, the dailies, the weeklies, magazines and journals, but also book publishing, textbook publishing, and the like, as well as radio and television. Now, we have in New York a somewhat novel communications device. It's called graffiti. The subways and the subway cars are full of graffiti, and also in our time, bumper stickers are an important part of the press as a means of communication. Various kinds of slogans appear on bumper stickers, and the slogans serve the place of genuine thinking. But you know what we're talking about now, by the press. I think you also know that, by and large, the press in this country, at least, and in our time, is left of center. It is liberal. It is hostile to what they perceive as capitalism. Now, they don't know what capitalism is. When we talk about capitalism, we mean the genuine free market economy. That is, business and industry operating within a certain set of rules that safeguard property, safeguard individual rights, and so on. Incidentally, the term capitalism is not one that we applied to ourselves or that we were the first ones to use. The term capitalism was used originally against us. That is invented by the left, by Marxists, to be a term of reproach. It was an abusive term. You may check this out if you'd like in the multi-volume Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences. This was published about 1934, and the man invited to write the entry entitled Capitalism was a man named Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R, Sombart, S-O-M-B-A-R-T, a Marxist, a European Marxist, who said that he was the first one to apply the term capitalism pejoratively in his criticisms and analyses published around the turn of the century. However, in a sense, victors decide what label shall be used, and we more or less have to use, from time to time, the word capitalism for a more accurate term, the free market economy. Point simply is that the people who communicate to us on radio or in television or in the movies are generally hostile to capitalism or what they understand by capitalism. You do not get in movies or television dramas the businessman as a hero, but quite the reverse. The businessman typically in television dramas is linked to the mob. He's an evil person. He wants to grind the faces of the poor in the dirt. He abuses his employees and so on. So be it. They are of the left, typically in radio, television, newspapers, columnists, commentators, and so on. That is, they would like to see vicious, rapacious business guided by government, prevented by law from doing or carrying out their evil designs. Now suppose that the people of the press, and we're talking about the Walter Cronkites and the Brian Gumballs and the like, suppose they get their wishes. Suppose that one industry in this nation after another comes within the control of government. Government regulations now control not just the railroad, but the airlines industry, the steel business, the production of all kinds of things. One factory, one business after another, at the urging of the press, let us suppose, has been nationalized. Now, once the economy, with the exception of the press, shall we say, is nationalized, does anyone in his rightful mind think that government, which is now controlling every other business, will stand respectfully at the door of the editorial office and treat that as a sanctum of some sort? Nonsense. It cannot do this. A government which has taken over all other businesses cannot have an independent press there to criticize its actions. Government will also take the press over. That is, nationalize newspapers, book publishing, and every other avenue of communication. Farewell, then, to what even our present pressmen think of as freedom of the press. I think that the press has a very vacuous notion of what freedom of the press is and implies, but they all say they want freedom of the press. No editor, so far as I know, is out crusading for government censorship. No reporter, no commentator is urging government to step in to tell him what line his commentary shall take. However, the end result of what they are advocating will be what they say they do not want. It seems that their self-preservative instinct is rather weak. People in the press tend to think of themselves as intellectuals. Now, the term intellectual, when it first came into the vocabulary 100 or more years ago, was not exactly a term of admiration. It implied, when it was first used, that the person to whom it was applied was not a scholar. He was an intellectual. He dabbled in scholarship. As you say that John Smith is not a poet, he's a poetaster. He's somewhat below the level of a genuine poet. As an intellectual, as F.A. Hayek calls him, is a second-hand dealer in ideas. Now, they're often very bright, but they are not the genuine scholars of the caliber of a Hayek or a Mises or many others that you could name. They are wholesalers of other men's ideas. But they think of themselves as intellectuals, and they've been to good schools, and they are bright and they are articulate, and they all tend to reinforce one another so that the total impact of their message is socialize business but leave us alone to exercise, in their vision, virtually absolute freedom of action simply because they are the press. But I'm saying their end result will be the demise of the institution that they say they want to preserve in its freedom, namely the press, the publishing industry, movies, radio, television, and so on. There's another group of intellectuals also hostile to what they understand as capitalism, and these are the people in academia, professors in colleges, in theological schools, and elsewhere. There are, in most of our colleges and universities, some able scholars, and there are still some great scholars in this country at the present time, but you never hear about them. The ones you hear about who are on the faculties of colleges, universities, and theological schools are the somewhat noisy, colorful people of the left. Now, these people believe in academic freedom. Now, they might not understand what academic freedom is, but they believe in it. I would define academic freedom as a situation where X university gives John Smith, who has the qualifications that they want, a classroom, a library, or a laboratory, and willingly pays him a salary, so long as the agreement is mutual. But John Smith has no claim upon the university to be given a salary, a library, a classroom, or whatever. It has to be a mutual agreement. Freedom of the press is simply where the government doesn't step in and tell the people in academia how their campus and their college should be run. But again, the faculty people you hear about typically are of the left. They do not like business. They do not like the market economy. They think that capitalism is a system that enriches the rich at the expense of the poor. Not so. But suppose they get what they are advocating, namely, suppose if they're urging government does take over business after business after business, whence the financing of colleges and universities. Now, at the present time, some universities do get their total financing from the taxpayer, but there are still some colleges that depend upon private financing. Once the government has taken over industry and business, the amount of money left over in your pockets after you have worked for a year will continuously diminish, and disposable personal income will gradually decline. Whence then the financing of colleges and universities. The private sources have dried up. No one else available to finance the colleges except the government. And once the government begins to finance a project, it cannot avoid taking the next step to be responsible for the way its financing is used. Government then will dictate the curriculum. The professors will become political flunkies on about the same level as the local postmaster, and academic freedom will be no more. Take an area a little bit more sensitive, one that I'm involved in, the theological or the ecclesiastical area. Now, I know a lot of honest, hard-working parish clergymen who are strong for the traditional values, but in every ecclesiastical organization, from the local council of churches up through the state council to the national council of churches, and going on, of course, to the world council, the people in the department of church and economic life are invariably left-wing. That is, coming out of church bodies, wherever there is such a vehicle or structure for pronouncing upon the economy, the pronouncements are left-wing or liberal. Many of these people belonged or did belong to the Socialist Party. Very few of them were members of the Communist Party, or at least sympathetic. In any event, the accent is from the left. While at the same time, these people, very rightly, staunch for the idea of the separation of church and state. That's about my least favorite American shibboleth. The aim of the first article was to prevent a national church. If you have a state church where the state uses tax money to support the institution, then you will have eventually dictation of doctrine. And the state will step in to punish those who deviate, those who are so-called heretics. So in this country, we decided early on to have separation of church and state. The churches should be independent of the political body. Now, when the Constitution went into effect, when the Bill of Rights was passed, there were still half a dozen states which permitted churches access to tax money. And my own denomination, the Congregationalists up in Massachusetts, were the last ones to get their feet out of the public trough. It was in 1832 or 33. But eventually, it was the sentiment of the American people, and a very wise sentiment I believe it to have been, and to be, keep government's hands off the area of life which ought to be the most sacred part of a person's life. Do not let government step in to tell the churches what to do. But that's a two-way street, of course. If you have organized ecclesiastical bodies putting pressure on government, they breach the wall of separation, which was Jefferson's phrase, from the other side. As you know, a number of church bodies, denominations, have full-time lobbyists in Washington putting pressure on politicians to pass this measure or not to pass that measure. But suppose they get their way. And their way that they want to get is the same as what people in the press want and people in academia want, namely more government intervention in the economy. Government is supposed to take over industry after industry, or at least regulate and control every business. Suppose it does this. Government's venture into the economy will dry up private sources of funding upon which the churches now largely depend. If the private sources of funding of churches disappears, from whence the funding for our churches? From no other source except government. And again, what government finances, government will eventually control. Assuming the churchmen do not want this eventuality, they should stop several degrees back of it to prevent its occurrence, which is the inevitable end result of the pattern of argumentation they employ. Now, I guess you get the impression that I am not wholly in favor of intellectuals, or at least in what present-day intellectuals are doing. There was a Frenchman back in 1927 who wrote a book. The man's name is, we call it Benda, I guess, B-E-N-D-A, Julien Benda, a book called The Treason of the Intellectuals. The intellectuals' treason, according to this French critic of 1927, was that they had given up the pursuit of truth for its own sake, given up the quest for genuine scholarship to pursue power and privilege and publicity. C.S. Lewis, in a little book which I would heartily recommend to you, comprises several lectures he gave at the University of Durham back in about 1946, took a swipe at intellectuals. He said, "It is an outrage that they should be commonly spoken of as intellectuals. This gives them the chance to say that he who attacks them attacks intelligence. It is not so. They are not distinguished from other men by any unusual skill in finding the truth, nor in any virginal ardor to pursue truth. It is not excessive thought that marks them out, but defect of fertile and generous emotion. Their heads are no bigger than ordinary. It is the atrophy of the chest beneath that makes them seem so." Well, what I've been saying is that there is a vital relationship between what goes on up in our skulls, as exemplified by what the press does or should do, what the colleges do or should do, what the churches do or should do, and economic freedom. Now, freedom of thought, bound only by the rules of thought itself, and freedom of belief, as best you can by using your reason and logic determine what you should believe, and freedom of utterance, bound only by good sense and good taste, are, I guess we'd call them spiritual freedoms, liberties of the mind, and they are our genuine values. Now, when they're threatened directly, when someone gets up and says, freedom of speech is an outmoded concept, freedom of belief means that people believe the wrong things, people shouldn't have freedom of thought, people will spring to the defense of freedom of thought, freedom of belief, and freedom of utterance. But my point is that these genuinely important freedoms are threatened indirectly whenever one cuts off their necessary economic foundation. The person cannot be genuinely free if someone controls his food, clothing, and shelter. Way back a couple of centuries ago, when three men were writing the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, one of the three, in two of his papers, invoked this ancient truth that whoso controls a man's subsistence exercises a control over every other aspect of his life as well. Freedom is all of a piece. Whose bread I eat, his song I sing, is another way of putting it. Trouble is that the people I've been speaking of in a critical vein, those in the press, in the church, in the university, think that economic activity is somewhat beneath them. They are believers, of course, in intellectual and spiritual liberties, liberties of the mind, but they think that economic activity, what goes on in the marketplace, in the factory, in the store, in the business, is unintellectual, is somehow not worthy of those whose mind is somewhere up in the clouds. But the thing is that freedom is all of a piece. Now, I know that plumbing and philosophy are two quite different human activities. But my point is that if you socialize the plumber, then eventually the philosopher will lose his freedom. Came across a pretty good statement along these lines by John Gardner in his book called Excellence. John Gardner said, "The society that scorns excellence in plumbing because plumbing is a humble activity and tolerates shoddiness in philosophy because philosophy is an exalted activity will have neither good plumbing nor good philosophy. Both its theories and its pipes will leak." The great philosopher, George Santayana, who taught at Harvard in the early decades of this century, was sort of noted for finding his happiness in sadness. He sort of loved to point out in his melancholy way how tragic things in this life really were. He reflected at one time, he said, in this tragic life of ours, the things we value most are at the mercy of the things we value least. Well, for example, you might say a few grains of thyroxine missing in your gland up here will stand between you and becoming an idiot. Or a tiny lump of lead in the form of a bullet can snuff out the life of a noble person. And you can find other examples of things that are inconsequential which can destroy something which is of great consequence. But the more examples of this you think about or point out, the more it becomes evident that the things which Santayana said value least, in fact, the things which matter least, the things which Santayana said matter least, in fact, matter a great deal, because the things which matter most depend upon them. And that's exactly the way it is as far as the economic order and its freedom vis-a-vis the things upon which the freedom depends. Freedom of thought, utterance, and belief. A man who is not allowed to own, that is, when the economy is completely straitjacketed by government, individual ownership and private property go down the drain, but the man who is not permitted to own what he produces becomes the property of whoever is permitted by law to own his production, the production upon which both depend for livelihood and for staying alive. A slave, by definition, is a man who, by law, is not permitted to own the fruits of his labor. Slavery of the old sort is not much with us these days in the world, but another kind of slavery, or serfdom, has become a genuine threat. It's a reality in many parts of the world. It's a threat everywhere. Hayek, back in the 40s, wrote his stunning little book called The Road to Serfdom, and made this very point. His point was that economic planning, whatever the intentions of the planners, will eventually lead to individual persons being put in kind of straitjackets, because control of their economic destiny means that the owners acquire leverage over every other aspect of their lives as well, what they believe, what they say, what they worship, and so on. And Hayek, in the book Road to Serfdom, put it this way: economic control is not control merely of a sector of human life which we can separate off from the rest. Economic control is the control of the means for all our ends. Take an example. Now, in a totalitarian country like Russia or China, the government treats the society as a gigantic factory. You are told what to work at, with whom to work, what you may read, and so on. Now, there's a good deal of black market activity in both nations, otherwise they couldn't survive. But to the degree the theory of communism or socialism is applied, to that same degree, people are controlled in their economic life, and that gives means for controlling every other aspect of their lives as well. Now, suppose you, at this very moment, suppose you were a citizen of Moscow. Suppose that by some miracle, a copy of the Freeman and a carton of Foundation for Economic Education books came into your hands. You had some facility in the language, English language, and you read these things and found that you were stunned by being in agreement with them, and you wanted to do something to convey these ideas to your fellow Muscovites. How would you go about this? Well, let's suppose further that you had some expertise in the printing business. And you decided to publish this new freedom philosophy. How'd you go about it? Well, you'd first of all have to get a place to put your presses, so you'd have to rent or buy a hall. In a country where the state owns all property, you'd have to go to the state for permission to get a building. You'd have to get permission from the state to acquire a printing press. People who would work for you would get permission from the state to do so. And all of this is very unlikely because your purpose is to attack the state. In this country, in a relatively free America, a paper like a Daily Capitalist, a paper like a Daily Communist is perfectly feasible in a capitalist country. But a paper like a Daily Capitalist in a communist nation is completely unthinkable. Or suppose that rather than printing, your expertise is in oratory, and you want to get out in public and talk to people about the new idea you've acquired. In a nation where every hall, every church, every school, every stump, every soapbox, every street corner is owned by the state, from whence would you launch your protest? Or coming down to a much more mundane level, suppose you didn't like your job. You're a Russian, you don't like the place to which the state has assigned you. What would you do? Where would you go? If you quit, you'd be sent to Siberia or possibly shot. George Bernard Shaw, pretty mercurial sort of a fellow, had a kind of a lifelong affinity for socialism. Believed in it, wrote about it, belonged to the Fabian Society for most of his life, wrote in 1921 describing some necessary conditions of a socialist organization of society and said, compulsory labor with death as the final penalty is the keystone of socialism. Doesn't sound like a very moral, ethical idea of a society to me. Well, that's my first point. The first point simply is economic freedom is important, not just because every freedom is important in itself, and economic freedom generates prosperity and the good material things of life, but economic freedom is doubly important because the more important freedoms, freedoms of the mind and the spirit, depend eventually completely upon freedom in the economic area. Now, economic freedom does not mean, of course, that you'll be given the job you think you are entitled to. Now, not many of us have been invited to come to Hollywood to act opposite Bo Derek in her next picture, or opposite Tom Selleck if you happen to be the other sex. So most of us, although we might aspire to something pleasant like that, adjust our expectations to the real world. Economic freedom can't promise you that you'll be the head of a gigantic corporation earning $1 million a year and having people kowtow to you and so on. All economic freedom can promise is that the number of job openings will expand beyond belief. You will have your choice of a whole spectrum of job opportunities. Now, suppose you can't find any of the job openings that appeal to you. Economic freedom says, if you don't like what we have here, you're perfectly free to set up your own business, to win a business for yourself. Now, this is no utopia. There's no utopia possible on earth. But all economic freedom does is to give you the best possible opportunity for the fullest exercise of your creative capacities. I've got about 5 points to make, and if I go on to number 6, I hope somebody will stop me. Under primitive conditions, a family produces most of its own necessities. They shoot their meat, they catch the fish they eat, they grow their vegetables, they might spin their cloth and make their clothes and so on. But we live in a division of labor society. Most of us work for a paycheck. We work for 5 days, Friday evening, we are handed an envelope with dollar bills in it, the equivalent of our week's work. Now, those dollar bills are neutral. We use some of them to go out on the town and have a restaurant meal. We go to the movies, we buy a book, we buy the groceries, we pay the rent, we give something to charity, we send a check to the Foundation for Economic Education, and so on. Now, these interlocking events of production, exchange, distribution, consumption are market events. Now, these market events are not random or chaotic. They're guided, Adam Smith said, as if by some invisible hand. Mises says, in his typical basic English, that the science of economics was born with the discovery of regularity and sequence in the concatenation of market events. All that means is that there is harmony in the production, distribution, and exchange of goods. Mises also calls economics a science of means. And I've been stressing a facet of that thought. Economic activity, making money, making gizmos, is not the full end of life for anyone. These things are the means to give us a wider scope to do the things that are really important in life. Really important things like play and friendship and love and marriage and raising kids and worship and prayer and reading and writing. These are the truly human things, but economics gives us the means to pursue these higher ends. Economics is then a science of means, and economics, Mises insists, or the economist cannot or should not try to tell people what the proper human goals in life are. He accepts from people what they say their goals are and simply tells them the most expeditious way of arriving at their goals. He says, economics is a science of the means to be applied for the attainment of ends chosen. And a science, he continues, never tells a man how he should act. It merely shows how a man must act if he wants to attain definite ends. Well, my definite end this morning, as I drove up here in my daughter's car, was to leave Smyrna, come out onto 41 for a short distance, turn left onto 285 until I found a lot of construction and saw a sign 85 north, which I got onto, and then I turned off here at Sewanee. Now, I had a good reason for wanting to come to Sewanee. That was the end I chose, and I was given instructions as to the proper means, which, if I applied, would eventually get me here, and as a matter of fact, it did. That's something like economics. The economist does not tell anyone what the proper goal for his life is. That's the function of other disciplines, like philosophy, like religion in the generic sense of the term religion. Call it some other label if you wish, but there is or should be in a society someone giving some attention to what the nature of the beast is, what human nature genuinely is, and therefore what aims the human being ought to strive for, the goals of life, or the ends of life, or the aims of life. Religion or philosophy, all economics does is to say, well, we can help you achieve those goals better, more expeditiously than if some other way of organizing the economy were adopted. The freer the economy, the more the true goals of life you'll be able to attain. It's been often said, from ancient times to the present, that man does not live by bread alone. The term bread there being used in a broad sense of, say, material possessions. It says there are other goals of human life than to simply increase the available quantity of material possessions. It's awfully nice to have a pleasant house to live in, with labor-saving devices in the house in the form of tools and machinery. Awfully nice to have an automobile or two automobiles, several suits of clothing, extra sport jackets, and so on. But our ancestors got along without those things. They add something to our comfort. The free economy gives more of those things than any alternative, but they're means to achieve ends which are beyond them. If we as a people, that is, if people in America are pretty well squared away as to what the proper goals and ends and aims of life really are, we could take economic and political dislocations in stride, and we'd have fewer of them. But if there is a lot of confusion about the nature of the human person, and hence confusion compounded as to the proper end, aim, and goal of life, then economic difficulties will tend to floor us. If some people say the chief end of man is to make money, and somebody else says, no, the chief end of man is to obtain power, a third person says the chief end of person or my goal in life is to be famous or infamous, to get publicity, or kind of giving up, you say the chief end of life is to get away from it, to take a trip on chemically complicated substances, blow your mind, and so on. If there are these kinds of confusions about the nature of the human person and the goal of life, then economic and political problems overwhelm us. The ancient admonition to seek ye first the kingdom is to say, in other words, get your priorities straight. Because if you know what the first priority is, you won't have much difficulty figuring out the second priority and the third. These will drop into their proper places and will achieve a fulfillment of the potentialities of human nature. That's my point number two. Once you understand that economics is a science of means, you realize that a means all by itself is meaningless. A means to become meaningful must be hooked up with some plausible end for which the means is an approach. So economics has to be hooked up with some subject that deals with human nature and destiny, which is philosophy or religion or your value system or whatever you choose to call it. But then you're going to say, well, who was to say what the proper end, goal, aim of human life is? And I'd reply that there are people who have been thinking about that question for tens of thousands of years, I guess, for a long, long time. And you know most of the common answers. Let me offer you an answer that one of my mentors, Albert J. Nock, deriving it from Matthew Arnold, put forth in several of his essays many years ago. Nock argued that in human nature itself, there are 5 social instincts. Call them motivations if you'd like, or urges, or demands within us for expression. 5 demands for expression. They come in pairs. The first, he said, was the instinct for accumulation and expansion. We'd say, for accumulation, we'd say the urge to make money or gain a competence, and the urge to exert some influence. Accumulation and expansion. He alleges, following Matthew Arnold, that modern civilization, say for the past 100, 150, 200 years, modern civilization has ignored or denied or perverted the other 4 social instincts, given free expression only to the instinct for making money and exerting influence or wielding power. That may be an overstatement, probably is. Let me list the other 4 instincts. There is, said Nock, an instinct for beauty and poetry, an instinct for social life and manners, an instinct for intellect and knowledge, and finally, an instinct for religion and morals. And Nock, following Arnold, said, we have belittled or denied the proper expression of these 4 instincts, and a good life, a life that feels good to the people living it, has to be one where these 5 social instincts are given expression in a harmonious balance. By the way, speaking of Nock, there is at the foundation a little enterprise called the Knockian Society. 3 of us met 20 years ago for lunch in Cincinnati. We'd been brought together by a common interest in Albert J. Nock, who, by the way, edited the Freeman magazine from 1920 to 1924. And the Knockian Society was born from that encounter over lunch in Cincinnati. Its cosmic address is a corner of my overcrowded desk at the foundation. We put out an occasional newsletter. We have a masthead that says at the right, no offices, no dues, no meetings. It's the next best thing to no society at all. We have as our patrons 2 men that Nock wrote about, the great Frenchman, Francis Rabelais, and the man from Maine of 100 years ago, Artemus Ward, and a personal friend of Nock during his lifetime, Henry Louis Mencken. These are our patrons. We got behind the publication, the reissue of a classic by Nock. This came out in 1937, Our Enemy of the State. By the state, Nock means government perverted. And also, we came out, we're behind the publication of his classic essay of 1926 called Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson. 2 books are available in paper. The list price is $14.90, and we offer them at a friendly discount 2 books together for $10. If you're interested, drop me a note. I see Charles nodding his head back there. He bought them. I guess they're worth buying, Charles?
Yes,
Okay, let's go on to our next point. Mises speaks about economics as a science. A science, by definition, deals with general principles. A science is not so much concerned with particular things as with the way a particular thing exemplifies the workings out of a general rule or a general principle. Economic science, then, deals with the general principles which, if the people of a society observe, will upgrade the general level of economic well-being. Everybody will have more. But now suppose that I have studied something of Mises or other economists. I've convinced myself that if the question before the House is, how can we so organize the economic life of the people of American society so as to produce the maximum abundance and upgrading of the general level of economic well-being? And I would answer, turn the market loose. Have the economy completely free. When the economy is free, then everybody will benefit. But I know that people will not appreciate me at my true worth, and if I go by the dictum of the economists who tell me that my income will depend upon how well my offering of goods and services pleases other people, and that'll be my wage, which in effect is to say that you people determine my wage, my income. How should you know what I am worth better than I know myself? And suppose I have a certain lack of scruple and know how to operate a racket. Now I know this racket of mine will not generate maximum economic prosperity for all, but it will for me. How would you convince me that I shouldn't operate a racket, that I should conform my activities to the rules of economics for maximizing the general prosperity? Additional economic arguments won't do that. You have to employ a moral argument. You have to say that I should adapt my activities to moral principles. Well, we know there is a great deal of debate these days about what is genuinely moral. The Democrats, I hope there's not a Democrat here, but the Democratic Party typically thinks we are the party of morality, the others are immoral or lack compassion. But among the Democrats, the intellectuals say that ethical values, moral values, are relative. No one can say what is right for somebody else. They say, I have my value system, you have your value system. Why should I attempt to impose my values upon other people? Or why should you attempt to impose yours on mine? It's all relative or nihilistic. Well, I think you can figure out that this approach of theirs is not a very valid one. I think you can figure out that if you have a collection of people, most of whom, most of the time, when they have an opportunity, will murder, assault, steal, and lie, that you couldn't have any society at all. If you want to have any society at all, and if you want to improve that society, you have to have people who on moral grounds will refrain from murder, assault, theft, lying. You have to have people who will keep their word, fulfill their contracts, not covet their neighbor's goods, and sometime, once in a while at least, lend a friendly hand to a neighbor. Well, of course, you see that these are some moral principles which are very, very ancient, basically the moral principles of the Ten Commandments, which is a recipe for having any kind of a society at all. And the more people apply them, the better, more high-grade the society will be. Mises gets into this a little bit when in his book, Socialism, he points out that there are certain things that are outside the marketplace. The market economy, he points out, is not something which comes out of nothing. Now, as a matter of fact, you can't think of very many things that come out of nothing. Nothing doesn't result in something. He points out, Mises does, that there is a realm of life outside the realm of economic calculation, on which the market economy depends. From his book Socialism, on page 116, Mises speaks of beauty, health, and honor. He calls these things, beauty, health, honor, and other like goods, calls them moral goods. And he says, for all such moral goods are goods of the first order. We can value them directly, and therefore have no difficulty in taking them into account, even though they lie outside the sphere of monetary calculation. In other words, there are certain things in life on which you cannot put a price tag. Justice, for example. If there's a price tag on justice, it becomes something else. You've heard the old gag about a judge who was amenable to money being slipped under the table, and someone said of him, the judge, his honor is the best judge money can buy. I'm mangling that one. His honor is the best judge money can buy. Or, can you put a price tag on friendship? Now you might say that this wealthy fellow who spends money like it's going out of style and has a bunch of hangers-on, he's buying friends. We know this isn't so. He's not buying friends. You can't buy friendship. You can't buy love. You can't buy honor. If your honor is for sale, it is not honor, and so on. So my point 3 is simply, the free market will not function in a society where the sense of moral obligation is either weak or missing. For something to qualify as an economic good, 2 conditions are necessary. An economic good, in the first place, is something that is scarce. Now, down here, out in this area, the outside air is a free good. It is not an economic good. You can step outside, you can take a deep breath. You take all the deep breaths you want, there is as much air left over for everybody else to take all the deep breaths they want. Economic would say then that the air, fresh air down here, is an economic good. Now there are areas of the country where the air is not quite so fresh as here. Up in Manhattan, for example, fresh air is kind of a scarce commodity. There was this typical Manhattanite who'd been out in the Western country, and he said he was delighted to get back to New York because he likes to see what he's breathing. So air, because it is in abundance, free for the taking, is not an economic good, so it doesn't qualify. Second thing to qualify for an economic good is it must be wanted. Well, air is wanted, but it's a free good because there's an abundance of it. I've often said that up in Westchester County, beriberi is a very scarce disease. In fact, as far as I know, been no case of it for generations. But the fact that beriberi is scarce does not make beriberi an economic good because nobody wants it. But most things in life that we are in contact with are both scarce and wanted. Therefore, to get them, we have to give up something. We have to give up something to get conditioned air, air that's been cleaned, warmed, or cooled. We have to give up something like our labor or money to get food, clothing, and shelter, and so on. What this means is that the economic equation will never come out right. We'll always be trying to catch up, to cope with scarcity. No matter how hard we work, no matter how often or how thoroughly we revamp the economic institutions of society, we'll still be coping with scarcity, never quite catching up, which led the great economist Wilhelm Röpke to say, economics is an anti-ideological, anti-utopian, disillusioning science. The candid economist has to be unpopular because he comes before people and says, folks, you ain't never going to have the abundance you dream of. You will always be trying to cope with scarcity. He'll go on to point out that the scarcity he's talking about is a relative thing. There was scarcity 100 years ago. there is scarcity today. Not that we couldn't produce all the beans that everybody on the planet could eat, but the more we become skilled in productivity, the greater the diversity of goods that we think of as needed. We were once content with a little crystal set, a radio, more primitive than most any of you have ever seen. Then we wanted a super heterodyne, and we wanted shortwave and frequency modulation, and television, and then color television, and now video and so on. These things, every new development, constitute a new area of scarcity in the economic sense. Not that we're hurting, not that we're living on the very fringes of life. If any of you have been to New York and taken the train from Grand Central out to Irvington, you would have passed through areas in the South Bronx that are simply appalling. Places where people shouldn't be living, where they would not be living if more people paid some attention to the advice of market economists. People do not have to live that way unless they adopt warped, wrong political structures which hamper the production of housing. At my point 4, things are scarce, and therefore we need a science of scarcity to help us cope with this awkward situation, the fact of perpetual scarcity. But the modern mind is passionately utopian. Most people today believe that day by day we are getting better and better, and by about next Tuesday we'll be perfect. It doesn't work out that way. Now, there is genuine progress in certain areas of life. Mention television. I think the first television set that I saw was around 1950. There was a circular dial about a foot across. It looked as if there was a perpetual snowstorm. Behind this snowstorm, you could see figures vaguely moving. And then in a few years, things improved immensely, and gradually color came in and so on. I first began to do a lot of flying back in the mid-50s. There's no question but what the jets of today get you there in better condition and faster than the old prop jobs did of 20 or 30 years ago. But there's still some justice in the slogan that a wit offered to Trans World Airlines. He said, after an experience he had, breakfast in Paris, lunch in Manhattan, dinner in San Francisco, baggage in Rio de Janeiro. There's progress in science and mechanics. We have more mechanical productive devices today than ever before. Progress in medicine. Some people are alive today who would not have been alive if whatever they had and got over, they'd had 50 years ago. We have more conveniences around the house, more gadgets, and so on. But then ask yourself, are the television programs improving year by year? I remember there were some great extravaganzas back 20, 25 years ago. Are the novels that are coming out this year so much better than the novels of Dickens and Thackeray, not to speak of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy? Are the plays running on Broadway at this moment that much greater than Shakespeare's plays? Is the contemporary outpouring of poetry about to outmode Dante and Homer and Keats? We can barely understand it. Is the latest book on the new morality by Joseph Fletcher going to outmode Aristotle's Ethic? It is to laugh. In the field of economics, some of you probably had as your exposure to economics in college those 2 fat, ugly blue volumes by Fairchild, Furness, and Buck, Principles of Economics. Fred Fairchild was one of the first trustees of the foundation. Today, the most widely used textbook is by Samuelson. The brand of economics that people get from Samuelson, I think, is not as sound as that we got from Fairchild, Furness, and Buck. Or about the political doctrines, there's been some encouraging signs in the past several years. The man now in the White House, I checked after his election, had been on the foundation mailing list since 1961. I think there was some influence there, some input from ideas of our side into Mr. Reagan's mind. The new man in charge up in Canada, Brian Mulroney, is on the foundation mailing list. There have been a number of other people who have gotten bitten by the freedom philosophy. Jack Kemp came to a foundation seminar in 1964, the year that he was, I think, quarterback of the year, or outstanding, some great award given at that time. He had dinner with us at the house that evening, Sunday, after the thing was over, and said he's going to play a couple more years and then become a sports broadcaster. Later he wrote in an interview in Human Events that the visit at the foundation changed his life and its direction, and so it goes. So things are somewhat better, but they're still not that good. Back about 100 years ago, there was a man in the White House named Ulysses Grant, and young Henry Adams was in Washington. His father had a high government post. Adams wrote The Education of Henry Adams around the turn of the century, as a private document first, and reflecting on those years of his youth in Washington, he remarked on the succession of American presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, down to Grant, and said that if Herbert Spencer had observed this, he would never have written about progressive evolution. A lot of truth to that. Well, I'm going to wind up by saying that the conclusions of the economists that this science of scarcity of theirs will never bring in utopia confirms an ancient outlook. As far as I can tell, a perfect anthill may be quite possible. A perfect beehive probably is in existence right today, but a perfect human society, never. Perfected human society is not within the human realm. Utopia cannot exist on any map of the world. And that point was at least part of the message of the ancient Christian doctrine about the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, which says in effect, there will never be a kingdom of any body of men on earth that could properly be called the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And that same idea you get from the Greek tragic dramatists, which always has the hero trapped in some situation from which he cannot extricate himself except by doing some monstrous evil. What this idea or this world outlook says to us is human life is in part a testing ground, a trial run. There will always be till the end of time difficulties to be overcome, hardships to be endured, but also the possibility of lots and lots of fun along the way. If we try to eliminate all the rough spots in life, what happens? People go out in the wilderness and climb rock faces, or they indulge in automobile racing, or invent dangers for themselves. Now, a little bit of roughness in life is something we all need. If you're a good sailor, you don't want a smooth, glassy lake. You want some rough waves and wind and so on. If there was a dimension of reality such that tells us we individuals cannot find our proper destiny fully within nature or within society, and if we're properly attuned to that transcendent reality, our chances of making our way successfully through nature and society are immeasurably improved. We'll then have a chance to get our priorities in their rightful sequence. We will not attempt to found a heaven on earth. The heaven on earth in societies such as Russia and China have produced what bear great resemblance to the old-fashioned pictures of hell. Leave heaven where it belongs, beyond the earth. That's my final point. Economics, with its insistence that scarcity will be something we have to cope with till the end of time, reinforces an implication of the ancient ideas put forth by the Greek dramatists and philosophers and by the Christian philosophers and theologians about the kingdom of God. Economics, to sum up, is a discipline in its own right. If you were to read Human Action, I think you'd agree with that. Human Action is a big 2-pound book that we sell at the foundation a great piece of rigorous reasoning about economics. Our guarantee as we sell this book is that if you will spend 1 hour a day for 2 months with this 2-pound book in your hands and read it, you will add 1 inch of solid flesh to your biceps besides learning a great deal. Once we have the proper religious, ethical, political, moral framework, capitalism, or the market economy, is not a system which has to be made to work. It works of itself, given the proper outside conditions. It is self-starting, self-regulating, self-controlling, and it pays us a wonderful dividend in the form of a free and a prosperous Commonwealth. Thank you.